Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. This week on De-Risky Business, we're doing something a little different. Our episode today will be divided into 3 acts. All conversations focus on how the United States is controlling access to advanced semiconductors and what it means for the future of the global race for AI.
So first, Geoff and I will provide a quick, or as quick as we can, overview of U.S. export controls in this space over the last few years, since the big October 2022 initial set of controls on advanced chips and AI to China, and ask when we'll see the next update.
Then we're very happy to be joined by Reed Albergotti, who's the technology editor at the online publication Semafor. And Reed shares some insights from his recent reporting in the UAE and Saudi Arabia on how these governments are negotiating with the U.S. to get access to the most advanced chips.
And finally, for our third act, we're joined by Pablo Chavez, a technology policy expert and adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. And we'll discuss with him the drive for sovereign AI around the world and how U.S. efforts to control the global supply of chips are influencing governments' desire to build their own data center and AI capabilities.
It's a great series of discussions that really ties together both the specific technical debates on what chips the U.S. will control with broader strategic questions on the future of AI development around the world.
And as a reminder to our listeners, we are still taking questions for our upcoming episode on careers in economic security. So if you have any career advice questions you'd like us to address or any other feedback or suggestions to share, please write to us at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. This podcast is supported in part by Amazon and by general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program.
Great, Emily. So let's kick off the discussion maybe by backing up a little bit and thinking, how did we get to this point on U.S. controls on advanced semiconductors?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And a lot of people peg this to October 2022 when we saw a really sweeping set of new export controls that came out from the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. But I think you actually need to go back a little bit further, and I consider the starting point the speech that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for President Biden, gave at a summit here in D.C. that was hosted by the Special Competitive Studies Project. It was a speech in September 2022. And in this speech, Sullivan set out a really ambitious vision for how the United States would pursue global leadership in a range of advanced technology areas. And that in and of itself isn't that interesting, right? Like policymakers give speeches all the time on how we're going to be great at all sorts of things. But what was really interesting about this particular speech, and looking back at the speech now, you can really see how this set the strategy and agenda for U.S. tech competition policy. So the interesting part was when Sullivan declared that there were certain technologies that would be force multipliers for U.S. national security interests and U.S. military advantage. And he particularly noted a set of compute-related technologies. So talking about artificial intelligence, chips, and quantum information technologies. And in these force multiplier technologies, the U.S. goal would now be to maintain as large of a lead as possible over China. And while that kind of seems obvious, of course we want as large of a lead as possible, that little bit of the speech actually signaled a huge shift in U.S. policy and strategy, particularly for how we were going to use export control tools, where for a long time, the informal rule of thumb had been that the U.S. would, prohibit exports of advanced technologies, obviously for military end users and end uses. So we're not going to ship advanced tech to the PLA directly. Okay, that makes sense. But otherwise, the previous goal of U.S. export control policy was to essentially calibrate the controls to stay 1 or 2 generations ahead of China in commercial or dual-use technologies. So this is basically like the run faster strategy, where we really were relying on U.S. firms having access to global markets, including markets in China, in order to drive revenue, drive sales, and then that all gets plowed back into R&D, and there's this virtual cycle of just running faster and enabling U.S. firms to stay ahead of global competitors in these advanced tech sectors. And the huge shift in the Sullivan speech then was that we're basically saying that's not the goal anymore. That's not how we're going to pursue tech leadership. We're not going to run faster. We're explicitly making some areas of the tech competition with China more zero-sum. Because if you think about as large of a lead as possible, it's either we could advance the U.S. Tech capabilities or we could kneecap China's. And so you start to see this unfold soon. But this speech really kind of set the stage for all of that. Then a couple weeks later, in October of 2022, that's when we really saw the ideas in the Sullivan speech start to be implemented in practice, when BIS rolled out a series of rules that significantly expanded the export controls on AI chips and supercomputing exports to China. It's worth spending just a minute remembering what was in those rules. For those of us who have followed this, I think we're familiar with it, but at the time it was like this massively complex, hundreds of pages of rules. Yep. I spent many luckily pro bono hours with very expensive export control counsel to get my head around this, because there was a lot of really complicated stuff in there. So it's worth just quickly recapping what was in that package of export controls. And there was a couple of things happening there. And I'm going to simplify this greatly, unless you want me to read hundreds of pages of complex legal jargon. But at a basic level, it did a couple of things. So first, the US controlled the export of advanced AI chips to China. So obviously in the Sullivan speech, he was identifying artificial intelligence as a key enabler. We know that the US has an advantage and a choke point over the most advanced AI chips, at least currently. And so we're saying those chips can't go to China. We also wanted to, in those rules, target China's ability to make chips themselves. And so there was a big chunk of the rules that was restricting the export of U.S. technology to specified fabs in China if those fabs were making chips at certain technical thresholds. So for logic chips, this was fabs that could make at 14 nanometers or lower, and there was comparable technical thresholds for memory that were rolled out as well. So basically, if you're a fab that can do advanced chips in China, you are subject to many more restrictions on your access to U.S. technology. We also, in addition to kind of these fab by fab rules, applied a range of controls on tooling, or the equipment necessary to make advanced chips. And here they were kind of mirroring the technical threshold that they used in the fab by fab rule, basically setting a range of controls around tooling that was necessary to make chips at the 14 nanometer level or below. Also imposed controls on U.S. exports to supercomputing facilities based on the amount of computing power within square footage. And then just to kind of put a cherry on top, we put a whole bunch of Chinese companies on the entity list. Now, there's a lot more complexity in there, but that was basically it. We're saying we don't want China to have the advanced AI chips. We don't want them to be able to make any sort of chip at certain technical thresholds. We want to restrict their ability to pursue advanced supercomputing. And we're going to add a whole bunch of companies to the entity list. Now, there was a couple of things that were really, really notable about this package, besides the fact that just it was huge, it was complex. The first was that, again, going back to this idea that it was the first time that we had seen implementation of the Sullivan strategy, what we were trying to do through this package, consistent with his remarks, was essentially freeze China's chip development and AI development in place. And this was how we were going to get to that as large a lead as possible in the force multiplier technologies. And we were clearly no longer trying to distinguish between military end uses and civilian end uses. We're just saying that is too complicated a task in China. And so instead of trying to kind of do this delicate dance that we used to be doing about really strictly prohibiting exports to military end use and users while trying to allow commercial flows, we're just saying, no, on a countrywide basis, we are just not letting any US technology go into China's chip ecosystem if it could support the development of chips at these particular technical thresholds. And that was a real change, right? We're basically saying we can't distinguish between the two, civilian or military. We're just cutting it all off if it exceeds these particular thresholds. And then at a more technical level, what we saw in this package was the rolling out of all sorts of clever new export control tools. So we saw the vast expansion of this quirky little rule known as the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which allows the United States to impose controls on an extraterritorial basis if there's a chip made overseas that uses US tooling or software. And the reason this works well in the chip sector is because most chips around the world are in fact made using US tooling or software, at least in part. We had used this rule previously when it came to Huawei, when it came to Russia export controls, but it was in this October 2022 package where we really saw the vast expansion of this tool to kind of manage the strategic competition with China. And there's like one little bit in this rule that I always like to point out because it shows just how crazy aggressive this was, is we actually used a foreign direct product rule to limit the ability of Chinese companies to work with TSMC in Taiwan to fab advanced AI chips, which is like bonkers if you think about it. This is a US law that is prohibiting Chinese, Taiwan commercial interaction. So we were being very, very aggressive with this particular set of the FDPRs. Another area that got a lot of attention, of course, was the expansion of the controls that were placed on the what's called the U.S. persons activity. So basically, services provided by U.S. persons in support of keeping fabs up and running. So there were a vast amount of new restrictions that were placed on U.S. persons' ability to service chip fabs in China. There was all this reporting at the time of like fabs just being like, wait, what do we do? Like U.S. persons might have to leave the country. Like it just caused a lot of turmoil because this stuff was so new. So there's a lot more that we could go into in that package, but that was basically the thrust of it of, we had the Sullivan speech, he set out this vision, and then just a couple of weeks later, we saw the implementation of it with this just really ambitious, bold set of export controls that was rolled out by BIS. But that, of course, was not the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly, you described this sort of super complicated, super sprawling new package of export controls that's like a huge shock to the system. And obviously what we saw after that is sort of, we were doing all these things, but almost immediately after the question came up, did we capture everything? Did we capture what we need to capture? And so we see, soon after those October 22 controls come out, one thing that we saw is that NVIDIA, obviously the kind of leading chip company in the space, begins working on a chip that will be just under the controlled thresholds, sort of specifically to be sent to China. So basically say, all right, we understand we cannot send, our kind of core leading advanced AI chip to China, but we are going to design a China-specific chip that is specifically made just to correspond to the thresholds that Jake Sullivan and the team had set out there in the BIS controls. So, there was some pushback with this. Some argued, this is kind of NVIDIA trying to kind of evade the controls or, abide by the law but not the spirit of it. I think that's a little bit misplaced in that I think, we have to expect private companies are going to kind of operate within the rule of the law, but kind of up to that limit. So I think the real kind of analogy we think about here is sort of speed limits on highways, right? That you sort of, the government says the speed limit is 60 miles an hour. You don't then kind of get in trouble for going just underneath it because the government was saying like, don't drive fast, right? Sort of, they set the limit where it's set, and we should expect companies like NVIDIA to kind of go up to that limit. And that's obviously what NVIDIA did. But I think, it really sparked this bigger question of like, well, are these controls working? Sort of the Sullivan doctrine was, all right, we're quite worried about China getting access to advanced AI capabilities. Are we actually capturing the right chips here? This is, as we've said, extremely complicated technically. This is like a difficult area. Again, we've sort of a recurring theme on this podcast is that BIS is doing a fantastic job and has lots of great resources, but frankly, does not have the full technical resources that exist out in Silicon Valley to know, where do we really need to draw that technical kind of threshold to capture the policy aims of ensuring China cannot build these advanced AI models for military purposes. And so, what we ended up seeing basically a year after the controls were first imposed, the decision was made that, no, the technical parameters were not quite right the first time around. That, specifically the NVIDIA chip that was being sold directly to China, designed to comply with U.S. rules, basically BIS said that those chips had nearly comparable AI model training capability. So basically meaning that, what China's capabilities would be with these uncontrolled NVIDIA chips was exactly what we were trying to block with the existing controls. So there's, again, we won't go kind of too deep into the sort of technicalities here, but essentially in October 2023, BIS puts out a revised version of the chip export controls, changing the technical parameters for what is controlled and, most specifically capturing this new NVIDIA chip, as well as a few other chips that had similar capabilities. So again, this was a bit of a controversial move. I think, certainly not as big a shock to the system as the first controls a year ago, but it did raise this question of, is the U.S. government kind of moving the goalpost here? Are we just sort of kind of making this up as we go and sort of saying, yes, we told NVIDIA you could do this 12 months ago, but now we're changing the rules again. Who knows what it's going to be tomorrow? I'm kind of sympathetic to some of the private sector concerns here. At the same time, we do have to remember this has been a period of very rapid technological change. So just again, to go back to this period not that long ago, but this was sort of between the October 22 controls and the October 2023 controls, is when you have the kind of the real big advances in ChatGPT. It's when the kind of, the pace of technological change in this area is moving so rapidly. And so, basically I think what's going on here, the government is trying to kind of keep up to date with technological advances, and they're sort of updating their assessments about what poses a risk and what doesn't. And again, the kind of idea here is that the original policy intent of limiting China's access to advanced AI models that have military applications was still what the US government needed to do. But there's a kind of updated knowledge that the technical parameters need to be slightly different to accomplish that original policy intent. So I think, that makes sense, but I also think it really demonstrates just how hard it is what the US government is trying to do here, right? These technical parameters are changing very rapidly. This is a kind of completely growth field. Again, we've got technical experts in government, but it's always going to be hard for them to kind of keep up with exactly what is the latest state of the art going on, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And I think the government is grappling with this problem, which it wants to maintain the sort of small yard, high fence idea. The idea that, yes, we're going to control the technologies that are most critical to military advantage, focus on the state-of-the-art technologies while allowing commercial transactions to provide otherwise. But it's just very hard to know kind of where you drawing the line for what's in the small yard and what is not. And so, I think where we've landed now is there's an understanding that this is going to be a bit of an iterative process. The kind of US government is going to kind of go back every now and then and sort of update what is being controlled as what is not. We're going to have to sort of reevaluate quite what falls into the small yard and what does not. And I think the challenge is sort of how do you do that in a way that provides predictability and transparency to the private sector, so you don't face these kind of complaints of, well, we're changing the goalpost every few months. Well, also wanted to be clear that, the original policy intent was controlling China's access to these models. And so as that happens, we're going to need to kind of adjust and adapt along the way to make sure we're achieving those goals.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? You hear critiques of the government that they can't keep up with technology. And then when they try to keep up with technology and have an iterative, dynamic regulatory process, they also get critiqued for doing that and for moving the goalposts. So they can't win.
No-win situation.
No win. And in some respects, the idea of freezing in place and just setting that technical parameter, there's an advantage to that in that if the regulatory parameter doesn't move, but technology does, you're going to capture eventually a wider swath of the most relevant, impactful technology, right? And we can argue or debate about whether that's actually effective and whether we can do that and how China's getting around it. But, that's, I think, was part of the motivation of just let's try to freeze them in place, because if we set the parameter here, the industry will, in fact, move on.
Yeah, and it's an interesting parallel. You're talking about the run faster strategy and going back to kind of Clinton administration days of export controls. And it's quite interesting there because if you look at, there were kind of quite similar debates in terms of how do we set technical parameters on high performance computing exports at the time. And what ended up happening then is sort of every 6 months we were going back to raise the threshold to allow more exports because the kind of state of the art was moving forward so rapidly. There's an understanding that, again, we were only going to capture the most state-of-the-art things, meant we're going to kind of keep on raising those thresholds. Now we're in a sort of, reverse image of that a little bit, where it seems like we keep on kind of having pressure to decrease the standards as we learn that more and more technical capabilities may be possible with kind of existing standards.
We saw rules come out in October 2022. We saw iteration and evolution of those rules in October 2023. It is now October 2024, which begs the question of whether we're going to have more rules here. And of course, we did see some reporting about a new package of rules coming out. That reporting happened in late summer, but we haven't actually seen the rules drop. So, we can share a little bit about what that reporting was, of course, with the caveat that it probably hasn't dropped yet because the government's working on some changes internally. But it was, again, expansion of many of these same themes, right? How can we expand tooling controls to make sure that we're capturing the full set of chip manufacturing equipment that China might be using to make advanced chips. There was, of course, the reporting a little while ago that talked about how China might be able to use less advanced tooling, including DUV tooling, to kind of make 7-nanometer chips. And lots of questions about whether they can do that at scale and how much they were relying on stockpiles. But nonetheless, that's driving part of the concern, right? So it's not just the super, super advanced tooling. It's, one layer below that. And can we capture that? There's, of course, the ongoing conversations with the Dutch and Japanese about whether they're going to mirror the tooling restrictions. Their companies are also critical nodes in the tooling supply chain, so if we can't get them on board, kind of raises the question about whether the U.S. should be doing more aggressive tooling controls at all. And then part of that package that was reported, again, in late summer of this year, was that we are going to add memory chips that were important for AI capabilities to the advanced AI chip controls. And then we were also just going to add dozens and dozens of more Chinese companies to the entity list. So if all of that happened, that would be a pretty substantial, again, another substantial expansion of the controls, but we haven't seen it yet. So we're not quite sure exactly where this is going.
Yeah, exactly. And, it really kind of raises the question of why is this stuck? What's going on? And obviously, we only have public reporting to rely on here. But it does seem like part of the issue, at least, is kind of hang-ups in negotiations with the Dutch and the Japanese. So obviously you mentioned they are critical to this broader effort, very important on the toolmaking side in particular. When we go back to the original October 2022 controls, so those were announced unilaterally by the United States, but it was also kind of clear, really at the time they were making a big push to bring the Japanese and the Dutch along with them. Sort of a few months later, the Dutch and Japanese announced a set of similar controls, not exactly the same, and there's a long back history on that, and sort of where the gaps may be between the U.S. approach and others. But really been trying to make this a at least quasi-multilateral process, to bring together a few of the other kind of key countries that control choke point nodes here. So, we've seen reporting from the Financial Times just last month saying that the U.S. and Japan are close to a deal on this. Lots of reporting about ongoing back and forth between the U.S. and the Netherlands on this. I think you mentioned briefly there's this kind of threat hanging out there that we will expand use of the foreign direct product rule to Dutch and Japanese companies. It's pretty clear, I think the negotiation dynamics are the Dutch and Japanese are trying to figure out how far do they need to go to avoid being hit by FDPR, and the United States kind of does not want to impose FDPR, but is sort of holding it out as a stick that it could impose if necessary. And so the question is, will they find a middle ground there that will allow them to all sort of move forward together? One interesting question as well that hangs over this is obviously the time of the U.S. election. So, we're now a month out from U.S. election. I imagine the Dutch and Japanese are, kind of asking themselves, is it better to kind of cut a deal with the Biden team now or kind of wait and see what happens in November to have a sense of who they'll be dealing with next year? Again, these are all kind of ongoing live issues that we don't have, full insight into how they're playing out. But I think it is interesting to see that, for whatever else it does with the U.S. is sort of making some effort to bring the Dutch and the Japanese along with them, even while it's still demonstrated a willingness to act alone if it needs to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll give my, unsolicited 2 cents of advice to some of our counterparts internationally on this, which is, I think if it is a Trump victory in November, the Trump team will be coming into office with a much more skeptical view about how far partners and allies are willing to go. And so dragging feet at this point could be the worst possible strategy. I mean, we could debate that, right? But, I think, for those partners in particular who have been right at the center of a lot of these really complicated debates, whether it's Harris or Trump, but particularly if it's a Trump administration, they're going to want to look like they're cooperating here because we do have that very unfriendly tactic, undiplomatic tactic of just expanding the extraterritorial controls and whacking everyone over the head with this stuff.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I guess the kind of counter argument is, do you want to wait until the next president's in place, probably whether it's Harris or Trump, but particularly Trump, to sort of have a carrot to offer up if you're the Dutch or the Japanese that, make it a concession you are giving to the Trump presidency rather than the sort of baseline that you're coming into. So, glad it's not my job to figure this out right. For the Dutch and the Japanese, but a complicated set of questions we're dealing with.
Okay, so Geoff, we've mostly been talking at this point about the exports of tangible goods, about the movement of chips and how the U.S. is trying to really execute a chokehold policy around that. But that's not the only piece of the puzzle that the U.S. is trying to solve for right now. Obviously, one of the things that has come out is this question about whether China can gain access to comparable compute capabilities through the cloud, through data centers that are using these chips, even if China doesn't have, physical control over the chip itself. So walk us through how the government's thinking about that, very related but complicated set of issues, which is something that we typically haven't really regulated.
Yeah, exactly. So, obviously the main focus has here been on sort of the direct transfer of chips and related toolmaking equipment to China. But I think, as you say, as increasing realization, this isn't the only concern, that China may be able to indirectly access compute or chips through kind of various other means. So, one maybe the most obvious and kind of easy way is thinking about just sort of onward transfer diversion of chips that are sent to a third country first and then sent on to China. So, this is probably more in the kind of traditional realm of export controls. You can deal with this with kind of evasion measures that could be imposed, but often quite tricky to enforce that logistically for BIS. And so one way we've seen the U.S. government try and address this is that in the October 23 rule from last year, expanded the geographical scope of controls on chips to focus not just on China, but also to include an additional 43 countries, sort of mostly in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. And it's certainly part of the motivation here was the idea that chips may be sent to these countries and then sent on to China afterwards. So any exports of the advanced controlled chips to those 43 countries now would require a license to go forward. So the second area that is getting into this and getting more novel use of U.S. controls here is the idea that, well, what if Chinese companies are building data centers abroad that could be used to train models? So we're not thinking about chips that are being sent to China to kind of build a data center there, but what if you've got kind of Huawei or Tencent or whoever it may be, building a data center in Malaysia or frankly in kind of Europe for that matter. So one thing that the October 23 rule did is expand coverage to apply to any company that's headquartered in or whose ultimate parent is headquartered in China, no matter where that company is located. So again, this is capturing, if you have Chinese-based companies operating internationally, but who may be sort of using their data centers, using their compute capabilities to advance China's military AI capabilities, we want to make sure they are also captured. So again, those are also in scope of the new rules. And then third, this is where we start getting kind of, really more complicated issues, is thinking about Chinese companies that are accessing compute through non-Chinese data centers. So think of, basically Chinese companies that are kind of renting access to compute from any non-Chinese data center around the world. And really, we can think about this in two groups. There's one thing about U.S.-owned data centers, so, the kind of Googles and Microsoft and Amazons of the world. How can we address that? So what the U.S. is doing there, they've announced plans for know your customer rules on cloud computing. And basically, this is going to require U.S. cloud companies to collect certain basic data from any foreign customers. And, most notably, will require them to report to the U.S. government if you have a foreign customer conducting particularly large AI training models. And so this is going to capture, if we see, again, kind of a company with ties to the Chinese military that's running a sort of suspiciously large AI model training, that would probably show up in this data and would allow the U.S. government to kind of take actions against it. And then if we think about non-U.S. companies, so, kind of European or other companies, kind of Middle Eastern, kind of Gulf countries that are sort of building out some of these big data centers, and what about the risk of Chinese companies accessing compute through them? So here, again, I think we're still seeing the government sort of start to develop its plan, but we've seen that U.S. government is thinking about conditioning licenses for some of these advanced chips going to foreign data centers to ensure they are aligned with U.S. security concerns. So we saw last month the Commerce Department announce plans for a new, what they call Validated End User, or VEU, program for data centers. The idea here is that, if you are operating a large data center in the UAE, for example, that is one of the countries that is now under the geographic scope of the U.S. chip controls, meaning you need a license to send chips to the UAE. But if you are a data center that says we will sign on to various technical safety standards in terms of kind of, controlling the physical space, controlling logical access to the data stored in these data centers, and particularly kind of some more, maybe kind of political safeguards as well in terms of thinking about, are you limiting Chinese companies training certain AI models, limiting Chinese workers' ability to kind of be on site in some of these places? If you sign on basically to the kind of U.S. wish list for security concerns, you'll get this validated end user certification, which will then allow you to import the advanced AI chips you need. So again, this is still a program that's in development, but I think we are sort of seeing the direction the U.S. is going to in terms of wanting to put a lot more controls on, how are U.S. technologies being used both by U.S. and non-U.S. firms around the world, and how is that shaping the kind of future development of AI models?
Yeah, I mean, it's a incredible expansion of what the US is trying to do, right? I mean, one of the reasons that we wanted to kind of walk through this couple years of history is, we started with an ambitious goal set out by Jake Sullivan and a set of controls focused on just bread and butter export control stuff, right? Like advanced tech, shipments of tangible items. But then over time, you realize that if the US really wants to deny China access to these critical compute capabilities that are going to be fundamental to its future AI force multiplier technologies, like it has to expand its regulatory reach pretty extensively. And so that raises all sorts of really hard questions of like, is the US setting itself up to be a global arbiter of who gets to have powerful AI? How is that AI going to be used? I think these are really, really hard questions that aren't even really export control questions in some respects, right? Like these are much broader policy questions. And so to get at some of that, in the next bits of the episode, we're going to talk to two experts who can help us think through some of those sorts of questions. So we'll talk to Reed Albergotti from Semafor, who's been doing some really interesting reporting on how this is playing out in the Middle East with the Gulf countries. We'll talk a little bit about some of the human rights implications of these powerful AI systems. And, as the US is setting itself up to, again, be like the standard setter for powerful AI around the globe, like how does it think about the rights aspect of AI systems and how to make sure these AI systems are rights respecting. And then we'll also talk with Pablo Chavez, an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS, who's been doing a lot of work on sovereign AI. So really great conversations with the both of them that we're excited to share with you, but all part of this broader conversation of like, can the US really control how AI is developed around the world?
Yeah, exactly. I really wanted to bring these three conversations together to show that, what started as, all right, how are we addressing kind of advanced chips controls to China? Again, sort of massively ambitious, but still sort of relatively contained policy objective, that we see it now kind of spiraling into this much bigger question of, what is the U.S. vision for the distribution of global AI capabilities, which is just sort of a central geopolitical question for so many countries around the world. And we think, there's just so many big questions to be unpacked here, and the decisions made, in the months and years ahead here are going to have really long-lasting implications.
So we're delighted to welcome today Reed Albergotti. Reed is the technology editor at the online news publication Semafor, where, among other things, he's been covering the AI race, including what companies and governments around the world are doing to lead the next generation of AI development. And we wanted to bring him in specifically to dig into some of his recent reporting from the Gulf, where he's been looking at the back and forth between the United States government, the UAE government, Saudi, on getting access to cutting edge advanced semiconductors. And this is a fascinating area where we've seen major private companies, Microsoft, G42, a UAE based AI company, announce plans for a big partnership. But it's clear this will only go ahead if the US government approves. So, super excited to dig in with Reed. And Reed, welcome to De-Risky Business.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Great, wonderful, Reed. So maybe we'll kick off. You've been writing about the ongoing negotiations between the United States and some Gulf governments, again, particularly the UAE and Saudi, to secure access to these chips. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about why is this so important for the UAE and Saudi? Why have they prioritized building out their AI capabilities?
Yeah, first of all, the UAE in particular has been like all in on AI for a long time. They were the first country to have an AI minister back in 2017. So long before ChatGPT got us all talking about this stuff. And as far as these chips go, they're all of a sudden data centers have become really interesting, right? They were something we kind of took for granted in the past, and now because of AI, they need to be souped up with these AI chips, right? The NVIDIA H100s and the next generations. Cerebras is another company that makes these things, but the Commerce Department doesn't want them going to China. And so, the UAE and Saudi realize that if they want to play in this AI game, they have to have their own data centers with those souped up chips, souped up data centers. And they've had to kind of convince the US that those chips are not going to end up in China, and that IP is not going to go over to China. So that's been sort of the tension there.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about this story is how the government has really been a deal maker in some sense, right? Like, so you've got this corporate partnership that was emerging between Microsoft and G42, but then they couldn't make that deal happen without the government approval. So what what were the demands that the US was making in these conversations? And what do you think it was that got the US convinced that the UAE and Saudis could be good partners in this particular area of the tech competition?
Yeah, I mean, one thing was Microsoft itself, right? I mean, the fact that Microsoft is a partner here, they do a lot of government work in the U.S. They've already earned the trust of the U.S. government. The other is that, in particular the UAE, and this is, people didn't realize that a lot of these chips had already gone to the UAE earlier in the spring, and were sort of sitting in a warehouse. They hadn't actually built the data center yet, but they convinced the U.S. government by saying, we're going to do, they had this whole presentation where they were like, we're going to do all these things. We're going to make the data center secure physically, right? We're going to have the chip part where we're actually computing that, either doing inference where you're running these models or training these models. That's going to be totally separate from all these other computer systems that go into data centers, right? Like that handle cooling, security, all sorts of other things, right? So it's physically separated. And then one that I thought, I mean, there's a whole list of these things, but another one I thought was really interesting is they will have no Chinese nationals working in these data centers. Interesting for G42. I mean, with a founder who actually comes from China. So all this stuff is I think part of the negotiation. I found just fascinating.
Sorry, can I just clarify? The founder can't even go into its own data center?
No, sorry, I don't mean to. I don't mean to say that. I mean, I think he's allowed in. He's obviously convinced the government also that he's someone they can trust. But I think that the problem with these, and this happens out here in Silicon Valley too, right? Is, I mean, there are a lot of people from China who are very smart and have their PhDs in computer science, and most of them are upstanding citizens and just doing the work. And but you never know, right? Who might be part of the the 1,000 Talents program in China, and maybe like siphoning off information, or maybe about to like go back to China with a USB drive full of secrets or something like that. So it's not so much about like one individual person not being trustworthy in that case. It's like, let's not even open up the can of worms there and allow like a bunch of Chinese nationals to work in these data centers, because how do you ever really know?
Great. So maybe building on that, this question sort of, what would a trusted data center look like? Obviously, we saw a couple of weeks ago now the Commerce Department announced its new plan for validated end users for data centers, which essentially allow data centers to have easier access to otherwise export-controlled chips if they meet certain criteria. So certainly when I saw this program announced, kind of immediately what jumped to mind is like, oh, this is what's going to happen for the Microsoft G42 deal, that, this is how they will get those chips kind of out of the warehouses and up into a data center. Curious sort of that also track you're thinking of it. Kind of, have you seen any reporting on, do we assume that G42 will be applying to be one of these validated end users as a data center?
Yeah, they definitely will be applying. I think that the visit, was the first time a president of the UAE has visited the White House. Was a couple weeks ago, right? That was really, I think, working toward this goal of getting these, agreements right in place. So they're definitely, I mean, this goes to the very top of the country. It's a huge priority, and it would really open things up. And of course, Saudi Arabia is also working toward that goal. They've also received some of these chips. It's been kind of under the radar. I think there was some actually reporting earlier today about a new chip license that Saudi Arabia got. So these are both big players who want to move toward that.
So, Reed, can you take us behind the scenes of the reporting on this? I mean, imagine it had to be a pretty difficult task to get folks to open up. And, we've been talking about this in the realm of the tech competition, but obviously, the US Saudi relationship has its own complications. The US policy towards the Middle East right now, very complicated, right? Was everyone pretty forthcoming about this? What surprised you as you were doing the reporting for this?
Actually, I was surprised at how forthcoming they were, and maybe that's just because I am used to being out here in Silicon Valley, where everybody has NDAs and is terrified of ever talking to a reporter. It's sort of, I feel like sometimes you have to be more clandestine out here than you do in DC when you're talking to spies and stuff like that. But no, I mean, it's not there. There are not a lot of tech journalists out in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. There aren't a lot of Western journalists, period. But especially focused on tech. So you can actually go and have conversations. I went to an AI conference in Riyadh when I was out there, and you could just have these very frank conversations about how the efforts are going to secure these chips and what they want to do. I even had one. I was talking with someone at this conference in Riyadh, and I was like, "Well, how are you going to power all these data centers? Like these U.S. companies. I mean, they're all talking about green energy and all this stuff." And I expected them to say, "Well, we're going to build the world's largest solar field or something like that." And he said, "Oh, well, we've got oil."
Yep.
Like
True.
that. Can you imagine like just burning crude oil in the middle of the desert to power a data center? It's just, I cannot see that happening. At least with a US hyperscaler like Microsoft or Amazon or whoever.
Great. Well, maybe, looking forward a little bit, so obviously, it does seem now that the executive branch has given its stamp of approval for this to go forward, but we still do see some questions coming out of Congress. Certain Republicans have sort of raised concerns saying, they're not fully assured about the kind of safety promises that the UAE and the Saudis have made. And this question of, are we really addressing the national security risk here and some of the risks that these chips ultimately could be diverted to China? So I guess the question is, do we think, are there more turns to come in this story? Are there ways that Congress might get involved? Or is it, pretty much a done deal now that this is happening and kind of the UAE and Saudi Arabia are on board as trusted partners?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know what would happen. I do know that there are people in Congress who certainly just do not trust any of these countries. They are clearly, they even though G42 has divested from all of its Chinese investments, there are still people very well connected. There are other firms that do have investments with China, and obviously it's all kind of leads up to the royal family there. So they view it as sort of these people in DC who I think are real China hawks kind of view that as just a national security risk that we shouldn't take. I had an interesting conversation with Vinod Khosla, the venture capitalist out here last week. It was published last week. And he was like, look, I asked him about this and he's like, and he's a China hawk too, right? But his view was like, we can't just not trust anybody. We have to take precautions, but we also have to just accept that we have to trust some of our partners, because the U.S. I think it doesn't work well, like technological development in the U.S. like staying ahead of the world. It just doesn't work well if it's a totally closed system. There has to be some give and take. So I think that's kind of where we'll end up, but I don't know. I mean, it's certainly possible we're going to see changes in Washington. So anything's possible, and I'm not the world's expert on the backroom dealing there. So
Zooming out a little bit, I mean, it doesn't seem like chips and AI are going to be the only tech sector where there may be an interest that the U.S. has in collaborating with Gulf states, but that's obviously complicated, right? I mean, so on the one hand, those states are trying to diversify, taking a long-term look, trying to get away from an over-reliance on energy resources, making a lot of tech investments in the U.S. But on the other hand, maybe there's tech areas where it's going to get more complicated. Human rights might come back up as a concern, obviously. So where do you see this all going? Like, is this particular solution that we're seeing here with G42, is that a template for other sectors, or do you see this as more of a kind of a unique solution to this particular problem, but maybe not applicable more broadly?
yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I would say like the UAE is a unique situation because they've been a really important ally to the U.S. And have also just been so pro technology and pro like economic diversification for so long that when you go there, it's just a very different feel than when you go to Riyadh. When you go, if you're in Dubai or Abu Dhabi in the UAE. So, they actually, one thing that always comes up that people always bring up to people like me who, are sort of like coming from the outside is like the whole pearl industry, the pearl diving industry. That was the major source of income in the region in the UAE until the 1930s when the Japanese came up with the cultured pearl, and it basically tanked that whole industry overnight. And they had to, went through a really, really tough period until they discovered oil. And they've immediately, when they discovered oil, viewed this as like a temporary thing. Obviously it's lasted a while, but a lot of people think it's going to go away. So I think they've been thinking about this a long time. I think there's going to be less controversy around that, but I think in Saudi Arabia, it's just a different situation. I think you'll see more opposition. We saw after the, Khashoggi killing that happened right after, it happened right after this big sort of Saudi tour of Silicon Valley, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that just really changed things. And I think it's going to be a long time before, before we sort of get over that, if ever. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's kind of where you were going. But
Yeah, no, exactly right. Yeah, go ahead, Geoff.
Yeah, it's a fascinating backstory. This idea of AI as the new pearl diving instead of AI as the new oil. I think that I like that analogy, so maybe we'll run with that.
Totally.
Well, Reed,
yeah, I don't know if it's the new pearl diving or if it's the thing that comes after pearl. I don't know. But there's definitely pearl diving involved.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Reed. This has been a great discussion. I really enjoyed hearing your insights from your on-the-ground reporting in the Gulf.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Wonderful. For the final segment of today's podcast, we're delighted to welcome Pablo Chavez. Pablo is an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS in the Technology and National Security Program. A technology policy expert, he's previously held senior roles with Google, Microsoft, and LinkedIn. Most importantly for the discussion today, recently Pablo has been writing and working on the topic of sovereign AI, building on some of his early analyses on digital sovereignty and its counterpoint, digital solidarity, on a concept the State Department has latched onto and made it an organizing principle for the U.S. cyber and digital strategy. So Pablo, welcome to De-Risky Business.
Thank you so much, Geoff. It's great to be here with you and Emily. Big fan of the show.
Excellent. So Pablo, maybe let's just start a little bit with some definitions. So you've written about the trend of governments around the world promoting sovereign AI. Geoff just mentioned digital sovereignty, and then we have digital solidarity. So just what is the soup here that we're working with?
No, totally. And I think that sometimes the terms get a little confusing. I can't count the number of times that people have been like, solidarity, sovereignty. I don't know the difference. So so it's a great question. So in the context of AI, there's been kind of a movement over the last really couple of years that's called sovereign AI. And the basic idea of that is essentially it's kind of an industrial policy of governments deciding to place the control of the development and deployment of essentially the inputs of production for AI data, models, training infrastructure, in the hands of domestic players to accomplish kind of national goals. And part of that is definitely about kind of traditional technology regulation. So there's a regulatory piece to it. But the part that it has gotten a lot of attention and that I've been very focused on is the part of sovereign AI where governments aren't acting as regulators, but rather acting as really market participants. Where they're building models, where they are acquiring and assembling AI competent or AI able supercomputers, and they're deploying these again to kind of promote the national interest. To your point about kind of where does this fit in terms of sovereignty, solidarity, et cetera, AI sovereignty is definitely an offshoot of the idea of digital sovereignty, which is really kind of a concept that started with the Chinese government. We can talk a little bit about that, but it's essentially kind of the idea of technology, digital technology being so important to various kind of societal goals, military, national defense, economic advancement, and so forth, that it's really important for the government to assert control over the technology. And oftentimes, and certainly in kind of like the Chinese version of this, to essentially kind of isolate much of that digital ecosystem, again, to kind of pursue kind of national purposes.
Great. So you described there the Chinese system. We've also seen in the past European governments pick up the idea of digital sovereignty as being something they espouse. And obviously, the question arises sort of, all right, when the Europeans are talking about digital sovereignty, are they talking about the same thing that the Chinese are talking about? So I wonder if you could say a little bit on, what's the European view towards sovereignty in the tech space, kind of in AI in particular, and maybe, against the background of some longstanding transatlantic tensions on the technology regulation front.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And candidly, I think that when a lot of people in the technology industry started to see European governments and other stakeholders talk about digital sovereignty, there was concern that Europe was moving more in the direction of China on these things, rather than kind of forging its own path, with a similar definition. By the way, as an aside, the term really did start in China in the kind of academic and government community. It was kind of cyber sovereignty or internet sovereignty at first. It got picked up in Europe around 2014, roughly. Don't totally quote me on that, but it was really started by a guy this kind of French entrepreneur who founded a social network that was at one point the 7th largest social network in the world. But ultimately he kind of got crushed in the marketplace. That social network is now a radio network, I believe. And so he wasn't particularly happy. So he kind of wrote a screed about European digital sovereignty. And in a weird way, that kind of got the whole thing started. The French government in particular has been very focused on the idea. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at kind of the European map, there isn't kind of a unified view of digital sovereignty, or as we're talking about AI sovereignty. But what I can say is that it almost certainly falls short of the Chinese model. That's really in many ways kind of technical. It's essentially kind of like a technical, self-sufficient, autarkic system that sits separate from kind of the rest of the digital world. So I think that the Europeans are trying to find a middle ground. And you mentioned before the U.S. strategy of kind of promoting digital solidarity. I think that is really the U.S. government trying to meet the French, the Germans, others, a little bit in the middle, and trying to kind of acknowledge their desire to have some sort of strategic autonomy with respect to technology, while at the same time partnering with the United States. And and hopefully that continues, and that becomes the basis for kind of a stronger transatlantic technological relationship.
So one of the issues that we're watching is to what extent actions that U.S. policymakers are taking may be driving reactions in other countries. So, for example, the U.S., as you know and listeners will know, has been progressively releasing a series of more stringent export controls on advanced chips for AI. Obviously, the concern is these chips going to China, but to make sure they don't go to China, we're continually expanding the net of other countries that might get the chips and then ship them to China or provide access somehow to Chinese users. And that's on top of just, a growing range of U.S. export controls and chip restrictions and the like. So is there a connection there? How much of the drive for sovereign AI is a response to the U.S. kind of clamping down on some of the key inputs to powerful AI systems? Or even if the restrictions today are kind of reasonable, how much of this is potentially a concern about how restrictive these measures of the U.S. might get in the future? And so it's more than just we want this AI capability ourselves. It's we're concerned that we may not have the inputs from U.S. companies that we might need in the future.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think in terms of drivers of sovereign AI, there's a lot. And one thing I'll say is that broadly speaking, there are countries that are engaging in the development of sovereign AI that essentially kind of looked at the kind of two-player competition between the U.S. and China and decided that they wanted to kind of figure out their own way in this AI competition. It's interesting because in 2018, Kai-Fu Lee, who was kind of one of the early people at Google China, was also very senior executive at Microsoft China, currently runs an AI company in China and is a kind of venture capitalist and so forth. He talked about the idea of how the future of AI would essentially be this kind of dyadic game between the U.S. and China, where every other country would essentially be a vassal state of one of the two countries, and essentially kind of the U.S. and China would subsidize their vassal states, and perhaps in exchange there would be kind of delivery of data and other resources to further advance AI. I think that kind of concern broadly has driven some countries engaging in sovereign AI. With respect to specific U.S. controls on chip exports or technology exports broadly, foreign financial engagement and so forth, for sure those have driven Chinese sovereign AI, right? So like undoubtedly that accelerated what was already kind of, I think, a secular trend to being independent technologically from the United States, but it was definitely an accelerant of that. It drove other countries for sure also because some countries are concerned about essentially getting cut off from AI technology, and so much, as so much AI technology comes from the U.S., in particular kind of advanced chips. So that was definitely a catalyst. Separate from the restrictions, though, there's also some requirements. For example, the Commerce Department has a new rule out about disclosing the training of large language models that have dual uses. And so that kind of concern about disclosure to the U.S. government has also kind of driven a little bit of the desire to train models outside of the U.S. ecosystem. And then finally, I think that perhaps, as you've been discussing G42 and other issues, these restrictions have kind of prompted some governments to look in the mirror and realize that they have to choose sides, at least for now, between the U.S. and China. And so I think that those are different reactions to American restrictions on AI technology.
Yeah. Is there more the U.S. government should be doing to reassure some of our closer partners and allies that the restrictions are going to stay, fairly limited? It's going to be the advanced chips that will continue to provide access to close partners and allies. Like, what more should we be doing in that space?
I think you've hit on something that is so important because I'm sure that the U.S. government, the Commerce Department, and other agencies engage with their foreign counterparts on a fairly regular basis. But I think as well that it is often the case that it looks like the U.S. is acting unilaterally and perhaps with something less than coordination with allies and partners. So I think just building on your point, the kind of explicit efforts to be transparent and consistently transparent and consistent with these regulations, and also to your point, assuring that they are really about kind of constraining the Chinese military, about constraining the use of dual-use models by state and non-state actors that want to use the models to, develop biological weapons and so forth. But I think, in particular, as we're moving to a new administration, we're thinking about kind of new mechanisms for coordination. Perhaps we should be thinking about something like an AI cooperation forum, organized by the U.S. That would coordinate AI or sovereign AI efforts where, you're trying to build models, you're trying to build infrastructure. How do you do that in a way that is, that has guardrails, that is rights respecting and so forth? And you could use that forum, exactly as you say, to kind of create assurances and to create kind of trust between the U.S. and its partners and allies.
Well, that sounds like a great idea. Someone at a think tank should write up.
Yeah, lots of great ideas for that there. So maybe we want to follow up a little bit. You mentioned, I think we can all understand governments having the view that they don't want to be vassal states of the U.S. or China, and there being some value in having their own kind of sovereign capabilities in the AI space. But curious, if we see more and more governments around the world picking this up. Do you think it's really realistic for all of these governments to be developing their own AI systems? Is this kind of, frankly, like a good use of taxpayer dollars? When you think of lots of middle-income countries around the world kind of, creating their own models, is this a path we should be going down?
Yeah, no, I think that is a key and critical question. So kind of like taking those kind of one by one. I think, first you're kind of asking, like, is this real? We don't really know, right? Like, I think we're early, too early in the process to know whether it's real. Is it worth it? I think that the answer depends on the country. So, for example, one of my kind of favorite examples of sovereign AI is a model that was built last year by or at least with the support of the Taiwanese government. That's the Trusted AI Dialogue Engine, or TIDA. And one of the reasons why the Taiwanese government built this model was essentially to counter Chinese chatbots like Baidu's ErnieBot that are used both in China and in Taiwan, and that sometimes give funky answers. So, for example, it was reported by the American press and also Japanese and Taiwanese press that at one point, if you were to interact with ErnieBot and you were to ask, who's the president of Taiwan, it would give you the right answer. It would say William Lai. But then it would editorialize and say, but it doesn't matter because no matter what happens in Taiwan, we're one
but
country.
He's not a real president.
But it's not,
So
don't worry about it, right? And so that impact on a country's political system, on its political culture and broader culture, that might be worth it. Other countries are thinking about kind of using AI as a catalyst for kind of economic development, and they have really good ideas about creating hubs and attracting talent and technology and capital, and so perhaps there it's worth it as well. But I think that it really kind of depends on the particular country, on its particular goals. And and at the end of the day, like how much money they're spending. I was looking, for example, at the Singaporean government spent or has been spending something like $50 million on a regional Southeast Asian model that they're building called Sea Lion. The Singaporean government's annual budget is $90 billion. This is a percentage of that. It's not super significant. For them to be able to kind of use that model to attract talent, capital, right, and technology to exercise soft power over the region, perhaps it's worth it.
So those are really interesting examples of why governments may see a national interest in developing their own sovereign AI, but there's a really big difference between building that capability domestically and making sure that you have access to that capability domestically, right? So why can't they just work with the big American tech companies to give them these sorts of capabilities? Like, what is it about kind of that organic bottom-up development that feels important to these governments who are thinking about sovereign AI?
So they could, and some of the kind of sovereign AI actors are thinking exactly about what you're saying, which is, why build our own supercomputer or, retrofit an existing supercomputer when, we can essentially kind of take this money, use it on American cloud providers, and essentially reserve compute on behalf of our startups, research institutions, and so forth. I think that's probably on the table for the Canadian government right now, which is exploring its own sovereign compute plan. The Indian government as well, kind of has this plan of deploying 10,000 GPUs. And that also very much looks like essentially kind of a subsidy program for private sector companies to deploy. But I do think that there are some governments that see government-funded and government-driven action as important, maybe not to replace, for example, ChatGPT, but rather to add something into the mix. And so what I mean by that is, I mentioned before the Sea Lion model that has been deployed by Singapore. So that is a model that was trained on the 11 Southeast Asian languages, and it's meant to kind of protect both the languages and kind of like the region's culture. It probably won't end up being super competitive, but it'll serve as a model, right? No pun intended, for how you leverage the local language, local culture. Depending on how the market plays out, enterprises might be using multiple models at any given moment, and so maybe Sea Lion is part of that as well. But I do agree with you that there is this really interesting question about kind of the blurring lines between the public sector and the private sector in AI development, and kind of a shift in kind of the point of view of essentially governments being the unit of kind of regulation and kind of cooperation on safety issues and so forth, and companies being kind of the unit of competition. And now I think that's changing a little bit, and so we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, there's also another layer to this, right? Which is, you think about something like Sea Lion, and that sounds very reasonable that you want to have an AI capability that reflects the language of a region, the culture of a region. But there's, the darker side to this too, potentially, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier systems that are rights respecting, and I wanted to pick up on that bit a little bit as well. I mean, certainly in the US, we haven't fully grappled yet with how to make sure that AI systems are rights respecting, that they're not biased, that they're not reinforcing discrimination, that they're not enabling cyber surveillance. But then when we think about that from the international perspective and think about that in terms of who we're sending chips to and the like, it's a whole nother dimension to this, right? Of how do we think about those sorts of standards of making sure these systems more broadly are developed in a way that is rights respecting?
It's a major concern, and I think that you're so right to point it out. Part of this is an economic development story, part of it is a national security story, part of it is a human rights story. And the truth of the matter is that there are very, very legitimate efforts to protect language and culture around the world in AI development. But you could absolutely also see that those efforts would be pretextual. They would be fig leaves for efforts to restrain free expression, to censor individuals and organizations, to violate privacy, perhaps. And it's not theoretical. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the Chinese government has a regulation in place that requires large language models and other AI models to comply with Chinese socialist values, which is a euphemism for complying with censorship. And so I do think that the U.S. government and other governments that kind of believe in human rights around and through technology in Europe and Asia and the Americas and elsewhere need to kind of factor this in as we're having these conversations about sovereign AI.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to a long-standing question we've come back to several times, is sort of really who is a trusted partner in these discussions, both for companies and for governments, and something that both the U.S. government and U.S. companies will be grappling with for a while. Yep. Well, Pablo, it's been a fantastic discussion. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.